Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and sometimes forgotten corners of Irish history. This time, we're going to talk about the last Governor-General of Ireland. Like most empires, the British Empire was rarely consistent in its organisation, and roles were mostly made up as things went along. During the 19th century, a system evolved where the foreign possessions of the empire were effectively ranked into different grades. If they were controlled directly, they were a colony. If they were trusted to be self-governing, separate countries, like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, then they were a dominion. The Governor-General was the representative of the Crown in those dominions. Generally a fist inside a velvet glove, as they were also the military commander of all forces in the country. The role was based on the old Lord Lieutenant position that existed in Ireland before the Act of Union, and things came full circle in 1922. Under the treaty signed that year, the independence Ireland won was not true independence. It was being elevated to Dominion status, Governor-General and all. How that came to an end and Ireland became a republic is part of the story I want to tell you today. Of all the colonial officials in British history, Domhnall Ua Buachalla was by far the least likely. He was born in Maynooth in 1866. Due to the laws at the time, it was effectively illegal to use anything but English for official purposes, like birth certificates. So his name was officially registered as Daniel Richard Buckley. But since his father Cornelius was a fluent and enthusiastic Gaeilgeoir, he was raised with Irish as his first language. This meant he always regarded Domhnall as his real name. When circumstances forced him to use an English spelling, he would always use Donal, the phonetic spelling of Domhnall, rather than Daniel, his official name. This linguistic dance reflects the complicated state of life in Ireland at the time. This is often oversimplified into a Protestant and Catholic dynamic, but there was often far more to it than that. Domhnall's mother Sarah, for example, came from a Protestant Quaker background. Her father Joshua Jacobs became somewhat infamous in 1838 when he was expelled from the Society of Friends for his extreme beliefs. This included a rejection of all technology, even simple things such as clocks, bells, and newspapers. Dye was also a technology, so the people who followed him wore undyed clothing. This led to them being called the White Quakers. His wife, Sarah's mother, was not one of those followers. Him leaving the Quakers effectively ended their marriage. Newspaper reports make the White Quakers sound a bit cultish, and Joshua was eventually imprisoned for embezzling the inheritance of his disciples. He wound up marrying a Catholic woman after Sarah's mother had died. Joshua died in Wales in 1877 when his grandson Domhnall was 11 years old, and it's unlikely the two ever met. Young Domhnall grew up in a country dominated by anger towards an unjust system that seemed to be set up to profit from Irish suffering. The Poor Laws, which had provided some relief from starvation during the famine 20 years earlier, included a clause which made farmers who owned their land give it up before they were considered poor enough for assistance. This meant that even more land wound up in the hands of the wealthy landlords. A growing movement for land reform dominated the country during the 19th century, with Irish identity and the Irish language becoming thoroughly tangled up in it. By that time, the traditions of Ireland had been eroded by cultural pressure from Britain as a semi-deliberate policy of civilising Ireland. In response, various associations sprung up to try to keep these traditions going. The most famous of these was the GAA, the Gaelic Athletics Association, which is still active as a major sporting organisation to this day. A related organisation that Domhnall got involved with was the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by Owen MacNeill and Douglas Hyde to preserve and promote the Irish language. It wasn't the first such organisation, but it was definitely the most popular. It was officially a non-political movement, but by its nature it brought together those who valued their Irish identity and who thus supported Irish self-rule in one form or another. The 26-year-old Domhnall founded the Maynooth branch of the League and became well known for teaching Irish classes. Domhnall had considered joining the Customs and Excise Service, but his father had fallen ill, so he took over the family business instead, running the local hardware store. In 1897, he married Jane Walsh, who switched to the Irish form of her name, Sinead, after the wedding. They honeymooned in Cork, which Domhnall was profoundly unimpressed by. He wrote to his sister, saying, quote, "Cork is a dirty, sleepy hole compared to Dublin. It looks well when seen from a particular point of about a mile or so away, but don't come nearer to it." In 1905, Domhnall became involved in politics, when his beloved Irish language became a political football. This came in the form of people being prosecuted for having the Irish form of their names written on their delivery cards. The law specified that delivery vehicles had to be labelled legibly, and it was the official legal position of the British government that the Irish language was by its nature illegible. The most famous such case was that of Domhnall Ua Buachalla, a farmer, poet and songwriter from Donegal. He was fined a shilling for his illegible name, and then another shilling when he refused to pay. The Gaelic League sponsored his appeal to the King's Court in Dublin, where he was defended by Padraig Pearse. Pearse lost the case, and he later described the verdict as, quote, "It was in effect decided that Irish was a foreign language." Incidentally, the same law was also used to prosecute Jewish merchants in London who used Yiddish on their signs. Domhnall was also prosecuted for having Irish on his delivery cart, and he also refused to pay his fine. This resulted in goods from his shop being seized to cover it. There's a well-known story that the goods were put up for auction, but there was a local conspiracy where only one person bid in them. He got them for a pittance and immediately returned them to Domhnall. There's also a story that Domhnall was defended by Padraig Pearse as well, but that doesn't line up with the story that Domhnall Ua Buachalla case was the only one Pearse ever defended in court. The two men were definitely friends, though. They knew each other through the Gaelic League, and Domhnall sent his son Joe to attend Pearse's Irish language school. Might even have been Domhnall who recruited Pearse for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or it might have been the other way around. The IRB was founded in the aftermath of the Young Irelander Rebellion of 1848. This was Ireland's part of the great wave of revolution sweeping Europe that year. It was largely a dud, with only a single clash between the rebels and the police before it collapsed. The main consequence was that two young men named James Stephens and John O'Mahony fled Ireland to avoid arrest and settled in Paris. This was a city that had a deep culture of revolution, and here James learned about how to organise a successful secret society. He learned about inductions and oaths, cell structures and counterintelligence. Armed with this knowledge, he founded the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the late 1850s. Domhnall's father Cornelius was a member of the Brotherhood, though he never did much. Neither did most of the other members, though breakaway groups like the Invincibles did carry out individual acts of terrorism. Around the start of the 20th century, the organisation gained a new purpose as the home of those who rejected Home Rule and wanted an independent Ireland instead. Home Rule was the idea that Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom, but in a devolved form with its own parliament again, this time with everyone able to vote and not just Protestants. At the beginning of the 1910s, it looked like the inevitable course of history was set. The British government would pass Home Rule, unionist groups like the Ulster Volunteers would revolt, and then the British Army would refuse to fight them. The IRB organised the Irish Volunteers to oppose the Unionists, secretly hoping to use this chaos to push forward into full independence. Of course, then the assassination of an Austrian nobleman in 1914 led to a chain of events that plunged all of Europe into war. Home Rule was no longer a priority. But the amount of military strength that Britain could bring to bear in Ireland was drastically reduced. So the IRB decided that, to quote one of their slogans, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." Domhnall was the leader of the Maynooth branch of the Irish Volunteers, making his own bullets for their weapons and leading their secret training drills. His old friend Padraig Pearse was both a member of the IRB Supreme Council and the Director of Military Organisation for the Irish Volunteers. In 1916, the IRB made an agreement with Germany to have a shipment of guns smuggled into Ireland. to arm the volunteers for a rebellion on Easter Sunday. But the weapons were intercepted by the British Navy and never arrived, throwing everything into confusion. On the morning of Easter Sunday, the Maynooth volunteers mustered at Domhnall Ua Buachalla's hardware store. The 21 men had the job of cutting off the telephone and telegraph lines from Dublin to the military camp at the Curragh in Kildare. They were also to destroy the railway line, so that once word did reach the forces there, they would be delayed in reaching Dublin. Before they could set out, a message arrived from Owen McNeill. He was the co-founder of the GAA and also the official head of the volunteers. McNeill ordered them to stand down because he did not think they could succeed without the German guns. The men were discussing this when a message sent from Pearse to Domhnall arrived, telling them to disperse and await further orders. The following day, word reached Maynooth around the afternoon of fighting in Dublin. Domhnall cycled into Dublin, avoiding any trouble from the authorities since they did not think of a 50-year-old man as a potential rebel. He didn't manage to contact anyone, but did determine that a revolution was underway. In fact, new orders starting this had gone out to the units from Pearse, but it seemed that Domhnall might not have received them. Some other units did receive them, but because they came from Pearse and not McNeill, they had ignored them. Back in Maynooth, Domhnall and the other volunteers decided not to carry out their original mission, but to head to Dublin and join the forces there. They made their way to Dublin through Blanchardstown and slept that night in Glasnevin Cemetery. The next day, they made it through the British lines and reached the GPO, the headquarters of the Easter Rising. They were greeted by James Connolly and Patrick Pearse, who told them about the situation in the city. At Pearse's request, the Maynooth men, led by Domhnall, mounted a successful rescue of a group of rebels who had been cut off in City Hall. This was a great boost to the spirits of the men in the GPO. Since Pearse trusted Domhnall and knew that he was a good shot, he sent him on several such missions during that fateful week. Domhnall disliked talking about his own exploits, but reports of those who accompanied him said he killed at least 3 British soldiers during these missions. In hindsight, even with the German guns, it's unlikely the Rising would have succeeded. The British had more troops on hand than the IRB leaders thought, and they poured them into the city through the ports and railway lines. Even if the Maynooth men had fulfilled their original mission on Easter Sunday and destroyed the line from the Curragh, it would have been a drop in the ocean. By Wednesday, the day after Domhnall arrived at the GPO, there were 16,000 British troops in the city, outnumbering the rebels 15-1. On Saturday, the rebel leaders at the GPO surrendered, leading to an end to fighting in the city. Domhnall was one of those captured at this point, but luckily for him, he was not identified as a leader in the Rising. As such, he was not one of the 15 people who were executed after a swift trial of dubious legality. Instead, he was held first in an Irish prison and then in a Welsh internment camp. He was released in December of 1916, thanks in part to the public outcry after the executions. The Rising did have 2 major effects on the Irish struggle for independence. The first was the elevation of Sinn Féin as the core party of Irish republicanism. This was due to an odd bit of self-fulfilling rhetoric. The British press had no real understanding of the complex makeup of the Republican cause, nor did they really care. Despite the fact that Sinn Féin were a small party with no direct connection to the Rising, they were still blamed for it because they were public and easy to attack. This meant the supporters and veterans of the Rising flocked to join Sinn Féin, and in fact basically took over the party. Domhnall was one of those supporters, and in 1918 he stood for election in Kildare North as a Sinn Féin MP. He was reluctant to stand, especially since his wife Sinead had died only a few months earlier, but he decided it was his duty to do so. The second effect of the Rising showed up in that election of 1918. Prior to that point, Irish nationalists had generally voted for the Irish Parliamentary Party, who advocated for Home Rule. But after the summary execution of the Rising's leaders, most nationalists no longer believed that Home Rule was enough. Instead, they voted for the party that advocated for full Irish independence, Sinn Féin. The result was that Sinn Féin won 73 out of 105 Irish seats, 67 of which they took from the IPP. One of those was Kildare North, making Domhnall an MP. Following the election, Sinn Féin MPs like Domhnall refused to take their seats in Parliament, in part because this would have required them to take an oath of allegiance to the King. Instead, 27 of them, including Domhnall, assembled in Dublin and declared themselves the first Parliament of an independent Ireland, Dáil Éireann. There would have been more of them, but 33 of the elected Republicans were in prison at that time. That includes Constance Markievicz, the first woman elected as a Member of Parliament in both British and Irish history. At the time, the government refused to recognise the meeting, but nowadays this is officially listed in the Dáil records as their first assembly. The declaration by the first Dáil coincided with the official start of the Irish War of Independence. The Irish Volunteers had been reformed into the Irish Republican Army. On the same day as the formation of the Dáil, they attacked a group of police officers, killing 2 of them. This began 2 years of guerrilla warfare. Domhnall actively took part in the war, along with his son Joe and his daughter's husband Mick O'Neill. The heavy British Army presence in Kildare made it quieter than the rest of the country, but there was still action, including attacks on Maynooth Town Hall, as well as intelligence gathering on troop movements. Right at the end of the war, they planned a major attack on a troop train. This ended in disaster when they were detected right before their attack. Fortunately for them, this came right at the point of a ceasefire being declared, which saved them from the inevitable reprisals. That ceasefire led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. It was a compromise. And like most compromises, it upset a lot of people. One of those compromises was, as we said earlier, that it didn't give Ireland full independence. Instead, it was granted the status of Dominion, but was still under the British Crown. The other compromise that people really didn't like was that it partitioned the island. Due to a variety of circumstances too complicated to get into here, while most of Ireland was ethnically Irish and religiously Catholic, the majority of people in the northeastern part of the country were ethnically Scottish and religiously Presbyterian. Most of this group were fervent opponents of Irish independence, and to recognise this, the British government insisted on keeping those 6 counties as part of the United Kingdom. There had been an election in 1921 of the second Dáil, the first in an independent Ireland. Domhnall had stood for Sinn Féin and been elected. But the matter of the treaty split the party. There was a second election at the start of 1922. Pro-treaty Sinn Féin versus anti-treaty Sinn Féin. Domhnall stood against the treaty, and this time he lost. The electorate endorsed the treaty, but the anti-treaty group were not prepared to give up, and the summer of 1922, the Irish Civil War began. Domhnall tried to mobilise with the anti-treaty forces, but as a former TD and veteran of the Rising, he was far too famous to escape official notice. He was arrested and imprisoned in Dundalk, alongside several hundred other men. One of those men was Frank Aiken, who had been commander of the military base there up until the 16th of July. Aiken had tried to stay out of the Civil War, but the base had been divided. A pro-treaty commander had staged a mutiny and arrested everyone who wouldn't formally join the pro-treaty side. Frank Aiken found himself, almost against his will, enrolled in the anti-treaty army. On the 27th of July, a group of men who had fought beside Frank Aiken in the War of Independence bombed a wall of the prison and rescued several men, including the commander himself. 2 weeks later, Aiken returned, blowing open the gates of the military base and leading an assault that resulted in the anti-treaty forces seizing the town. The prisoners, including Domhnall Ua Buachalla, were released. Domhnall headed back to Dublin, as he was a bit too old at 56 for the countryside guerrilla fighting that the war had turned into. He spent the next few months in hiding, before he was recognised and arrested again in early 1923. Domhnall was in an internment camp as the Civil War gradually wound down to an end. After most of the anti-treaty leadership were either captured or killed, the reluctant rebel Frank Aiken had become the de facto leader of the anti-treaty forces. As it became clear the war was unwinnable, Aiken declared a ceasefire. Most of the anti-treaty forces were interned alongside Domhnall, and it was months or even years before they were released. The ceasefire was in effect a surrender, and the Anglo-Irish Treaty went into effect. Because of this, many refused to participate in the new political system, especially because TDs, members of the Dáil, and senators had to swear loyalty to the Crown. This requirement was soon removed, and that led to a crisis for Sinn Féin. In 1926, the party's annual conference passed a vote that they should still not take part in politics, as they did not recognise the Free State as legitimate. Those who disagreed left the party. They were led by Eamon de Valera, who had fought alongside Domhnall in the Easter Rising and the Civil War. They were once again on the same side, as Domhnall was a founding member of de Valera's new party, Fianna Fáil. Domhnall was among those elected as TDs for the new party in the 1927 election. Ironically, the oath of loyalty was still actually in effect at this time, but having gone to the effort of splitting from Sinn Féin, it was decided that the Fianna Fáil members would take their seats in the House anyway. The party leadership officially declared the oath an empty formula. They won 44 seats out of 153, the majority taken from Sinn Féin. This established them as the largest opposition party, and over the next 5 years they worked to consolidate their position and legitimise themselves. Fianna Fáil won a majority in the 1932 elections, aided by the effects of the Great Depression, which had helped to turn people against the government. Domhnall, however, lost his seat. As compensation, de Valera appointed him as the head of a commission investigating conditions in the Gaeltacht, areas of Ireland where it was officially recognised that Irish was the first language. This meshed well with Domhnall's own interests, and he was glad to step out of the public eye. He had never really been happy with his position as a TD, and had always disliked public office. He had no idea that de Valera was about to ask him to take on the most public office in the country. Under the Anglo-Irish Treaty, Ireland was now a dominion of the British Empire, and this meant that it needed a Governor-General. This person was appointed by the British King, initially on the advice of the Irish and British governments. Under this rule, the first Governor-General was Tim Healy, a former Home Rule MP who was trusted by both governments. During his time in office, the British Imperial Conference in 1926 changed the role of Governor-General entirely. They no longer represented the will of the British government in dominions, but instead simply acted as a representative of the King, and the power to nominate them was entirely in the hands of the Dominion government. This also gave the Irish government the power to set a term limit for a Governor-General, which they fixed at 5 years. In 1928, the pro-treaty government of W.T. Cosgrove appointed James McNeill, a highly respected politician and diplomat who was one of those jailed after the Easter Rising. Problems began in 1932, when Fianna Fáil became the new government. McNeill was a strong supporter of Irish independence, who had gone to bat with the British establishment more than once, and who even altered the procedure for appointing the new government to avoid embarrassing Fianna Fáil. But none of that mattered to de Valera or his ministers. They did their best to humiliate him at any state function they shared with him, which led to arguments that eventually caused him to resign a month before the end of his term. De Valera was left to decide who to appoint as the new Governor-General. He wanted someone who would take the job but be willing to stay completely out of the public eye. The self-effacing Domhnall Ua Buachalla, who had only reluctantly been pulled into the office of TD, was perfect. It's just a bonus that this meant the Governor-General would be an outspoken Irish nationalist who had been arrested for armed rebellion against the Crown. The request came as a great shock to Domhnall, and it took him several weeks to decide on an answer. Eventually, swayed by his friendship and faith in de Valera, he agreed. As a mark of his intentions, when Domhnall swore an oath of loyalty to King George V as part of assuming the office, he did so in Irish. He also always referred to his job by the Irish word seanascal, which means seneschal. Once in the job, he and de Valera conspired to keep his public appearances to the bare minimum. His job was to dissolve the Dáil, pass on proclamations from the King, and appoint members to the Executive Council, the independent government of Ireland. De Valera's official title was President of the Executive Council, not Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, which would come later. In order to reduce his public profile further, Domhnall did not take up residence in the Viceregal Lodge, nowadays better known as Aras in Uachtaráin, but rented a house in Monkstown. This would later cause issues. Exactly what de Valera's long-term plan was is up for debate, but in 1936 a golden opportunity fell into his lap. King Edward of England planned to marry Wallis Simpson, a divorcee. This resulted in him being forced to abdicate the throne of England, and this caused a constitutional crisis throughout the empire. All the member states had to assent to the abdication. Ireland took advantage of this by threatening to withhold its assent unless it could formally exit the empire, setting the grounds for it becoming a republic. As a result, in December of 1936, Domhnall had the pleasure of signing a bill that officially made him redundant. After he left office, though, Domhnall and De Valera had a falling out about that house in Monkstown. Domhnall had rented it in a 5-year lease, the understanding that the Irish government would cover the cost. This was part of an arrangement where he only claimed £2,000 of his £10,000 a year salary in order to devalue his position. When the position was abolished 11 months before that lease expired, the government told him they were not going to pay the rest of his rent, and he was liable for the remainder of the lease. Domhnall wound up threatening them with a court case. In order to avoid the public scandal, they were forced into a generous settlement. Domhnall attended the inauguration of his successor, Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland. After that, he retired from public life, concentrating on running his hardware store in Maynooth and on local cultural events. He became well known as a letter writer to Irish newspapers, frequently voicing his concern about the influence of foreign culture on the Irish way of life. He and De Valera reconciled, enough that when Dev became president himself in 1959, he appointed Domhnall as a member of his advisory council. This was largely a symbolic gesture, as Domhnall was in his 90s by this point. He died 4 years later in 1963 and was given a state military funeral, recognising his status as a veteran of the Rising. Nowadays, despite his accomplishments, he is mostly an obscure figure, with his name known to few in the country he was once officially in charge of. One suspects that's exactly the way the eternally modest Domhnall Ua Buachalla would have preferred it. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.